grand tapestry of European history, few figures loom as large or as intriguingly as Frederick the Great. Born Frederick II of Prussia, ascending to the throne in 1740, Frederick would reign for nearly half a century, a period marked by intense military campaigns, sweeping cultural advancements, and the transformation of Prussia into a formidable power. Known as a military strategist par excellence, Frederick's name has become synonymous with battlefield brilliance, yet his legacy extends far beyond the annals of war. He was also an enlightened monarch, a philosopher king whose passion for the arts, music, and literature left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of his time. This unique blend of martial and intellectual pursuits has secured Frederick's place as one of the most significant figures in European history. In this exploration of Frederick the Great's life and legacy, I will delve deep into the facets that defined his rule. Together, we will uncover the brilliance behind his military strategies, which revolutionized warfare and secured Prussia's place among the great European powers. Additionally, we'll examine his role as an enlightened ruler, one who embraced and promoted the ideals of the Enlightenment, fostering an environment where philosophy, music, and the arts could flourish. Frederick's reign was not just about the expansion of borders, but also the expansion of minds, and his influence continues to resonate in the realms of politics and culture to this day. Welcome to the ASMR History Channel, where I combine the rigour of historical analysis with the tranquility of ASMR. Here, I make history not just informative, but also soothing, creating a space where you can learn and relax at the same time. If you're intrigued by the stories of the past, I invite you to subscribe and join me on this calming journey through history's most fascinating tales. As we begin this exploration of Frederick the Great, let's first turn back the clock and examine the early life and background that shaped this extraordinary ruler. On a cold winter's day in Berlin, January the 24th, 1712, a child was born who would one day reshape the destiny of Europe. This child, named Frederick, was the son of King Frederick William the Bear and Queen Sophia Dorothea, destined from birth to inherit the throne of Prussia. As a member of the powerful Hohenzollern family, Frederick's life was set against a backdrop of high expectations and an unwavering sense of duty. From the moment he drew his first breath, the weight of a kingdom rested on his small shoulders, with every move watched by the towering figures of his lineage. Frederick's early years, however, were far from the idyllic childhood one might expect for a future king. His father, King Frederick William was a man of iron, a ruler known for his strict militarism and an obsession with discipline that bordered on the fanatical. This soldier king envisioned a son moulded in his own image, a warrior prince who would one day lead Prussia to glory on the battlefield. Yet, from a young age, Frederick displayed a temperament that clashed violently with his father's expectations. While the king drilled troops in the courtyard and obsessed over the minutiae of military organisation, young Frederick found solace in music, literature, and philosophy. He was a sensitive soul, drawn more to the notes of a flute than the clamour of a soldier's march, more interested in the pages of ancient texts than the harsh realities of military life. This stark difference in interests between father and son of swords and guns, but of wills and ideals. The young prince lived in a world where his true interests were not just dismissed, but punished, driving him further into the arms of his books and instruments, where he could at least find peace and understanding. Yet, even in this oppressive environment, Frederick's mind began to flourish, nourished by the very things his father despised. He found inspiration in the works of Enlightenment thinkers, whose ideas were beginning to ripple through the courts of Europe. Among these influences, Voltaire, the sharp-witted French philosopher, stood out as a beacon of intellectual freedom. Frederick was captivated by Voltaire's writings, which championed reason, individual rights, and a questioning of traditional authority. These ideas were as intoxicating as they were dangerous for a young prince living under the thumb of an authoritarian father. Frederick's growing admiration for the Enlightenment did more than shape his intellectual landscape. It fueled his desire for personal freedom. At the age of 18, in a desperate bid to escape his father's suffocating control, Frederick attempted to flee Prussia with a close friend. This act of rebellion, however, was doomed to fail. The pair were caught, and the consequences were dire. Frederick was subjected to a humiliating public trial, and his friend was brutally executed as a warning. The event was a turning point in Frederick's life. He was forced to confront the harsh realities of his position and the impossibility of escaping his royal duties. The failed escape did not break Frederick's spirit, but it did temper it. He emerged from the ordeal with a renewed sense of resolve, realizing that if he could not escape his fate, he would shape it. Frederick began to reconcile his love for the arts with the demands of his royal role, adopting a dual identity that would come to define his reign. He would be the philosopher king, a ruler who could wield a sword as deftly as he could compose music, who could command an army and a court with equal skill. As Frederick slowly came to terms with his future, the shadow of his father's expectations still loomed large. Yet, beneath that shadow, a new Frederick was beginning to emerge, one who would eventually take the reins of power and lead Prussia in a way that neither his father nor the world could have anticipated. With these formative experiences behind him, Frederick stood on the cusp of a new chapter in his life. His rise to power was not merely the result of birthright, but of a hard-fought personal journey, a journey that would soon see him ascend to the throne of Prussia and begin a reign that would change the course of European history forever. The death of King Frederick William in May 1740 marked the beginning of a new era for Prussia. At just 28 years old, Frederick II, the son who had been moulded under the strict and often brutal hand of his father, ascended to the throne. The transition of power was far from smooth. The late king had left behind a well-trained army and a full treasury, but also a kingdom burdened by rigid militarism and an uneasy nobility. For Frederick, the challenge was clear. He had to establish his own authority and vision while navigating the lingering expectations of his father's reign. The eyes of Europe were on him, questioning whether this flute-playing, poetry-loving prince could truly lead a nation. Frederick wasted no time in asserting his rule. His father's legacy was a powerful shadow, but Frederick was determined to step out from under it and carve his own path. His first acts as king were carefully calculated to display both strength and a clear father had built, but began to distance himself from the severe austerity that had characterized his father's reign. Frederick wanted to be seen not just as a warrior king, but as a ruler who understood and cared for his people. One of Frederick's earliest moves was to implement a series of reforms that would lay the foundation for a stronger, more efficient state. These reforms touched every corner of Prussian life. Economically, Frederick sought to stimulate growth by encouraging agricultural development, improving infrastructure, and promoting trade. He invited immigrants to settle in Prussia, particularly those with skills in agriculture and industry, in an effort to boost productivity and diversify the economy. His policies reflected a blend of pragmatism and innovation, aiming to increase the prosperity of his kingdom while ensuring its self-sufficiency. Frederick's legal reforms were equally transformative. He was a ruler who believed in the power of law to shape society and was determined to bring fairness and efficiency to the Prussian legal system. He streamlined legal procedures, reducing the influence of local nobles who had long held disproportionate power over the judiciary. His reforms ensured that justice was more accessible and equitable, with an emphasis on merit rather than birthright. These changes were not just administrative, but ideological, reflecting Frederick's commitment to Enlightenment principles. Another key aspect of Frederick's early reign was his promotion of religious tolerance. In an age when religious conflicts were still a source of major strife across Europe, Frederick took a different approach. He declared that all his subjects, regardless of faith, were free to practice their religion without fear of persecution. This policy wasn't just an expression of personal belief, it was a strategic move to stabilize his realm and encourage the settlement of industrious immigrants. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, all found a place in Frederick's Prussia, contributing to its economic and cultural vitality. While these domestic reforms were crucial in establishing Frederick's authority at home, his attention soon turned to the intricate web of European diplomacy. The balance of power in Europe was delicate, and Frederick knew that Prussia's position on the continent depended not only on the strength of its army, but also on the cunning of its diplomacy. His father had left behind a kingdom that was militarily strong but diplomatically isolated. Frederick sought to change that. Frederick's early diplomatic efforts were marked by a keen understanding of the shifting alliances and rivalries that characterized European politics. He recognized that to secure Prussia's future, he needed to position his kingdom as a central player in the continent's affairs. One of his first moves was to strengthen ties with France and Russia, two powers that had historically been wary of Prussia's ambitions. By cultivating these relationships, Frederick hoped to create a buffer against the Habsburgs of Austria, Prussia's traditional rivals. But Frederick's diplomacy was not just about building alliances, it was also about timing. He knew that a well-timed alliance or a strategically delayed commitment could tip the scales of power in Europe. Frederick was careful to maintain a delicate balance, ensuring that Prussia was never too closely tied to any one power, thus retaining the freedom to act in its own interests. This diplomatic dexterity was a hallmark of Frederick's early reign, setting the stage for the military campaigns that would soon follow. As Frederick solidified his control over Prussia, He also began to eye the opportunities and challenges beyond its borders. His reforms had strengthened the state, and his diplomatic manoeuvring had positioned Prussia as a rising power in Europe. But Frederick was not content to simply maintain the status quo. He saw the potential for expansion, for securing Prussia's place as a major player on the European stage. His ambitions would soon lead him into the turbulent waters of war, where his skills as a military leader would be tested as never before. With Prussia's foundations firmly laid and its position in Europe carefully secured, Frederick turned his attention to a region that would become central to his legacy, Silesia. The coming years would see Frederick embroiled in a series of conflicts that would define his reign and change the map of Europe. The early 18th century was a time of shifting alliances, dynastic disputes, and fierce competition for power across Europe. Among the most significant of these conflicts was the War of Austrian Succession, a war that would shape the continent's future and elevate Frederick the Great from a young, ambitious king to one of the most formidable rulers of his time. The roots of this war lay in the death of Emperor Charles VI in 1740 and the subsequent succession of his daughter Maria Theresa to the Habsburg throne. Despite Charles VI's efforts to secure her right to rule through the pragmatic sanction, Maria Theresa's ascension was immediately contested by other European powers, eager to exploit what they perceived as a moment of Habsburg weakness. Frederick, newly crowned as King of Prussia, saw in this crisis an opportunity to expand his realm and solidify his power. Silesia, a rich and strategically valuable region bordering Prussia, caught his eye. Though officially a Habsburg possession, Silesia was a prize worth fighting for. Frederick's decision to invade was not just a gamble for territorial gain. It was a calculated move to challenge Austria's dominance in Central Europe and to assert Prussia as a rising power. The invasion of Silesia in late 1740 marked the beginning of what would come to be known as the First Silesian War. The First Silesian War, 1740 to 1742, was Frederick's baptism by fire. He led his troops with a mix of caution and audacity, quickly learning the realities of warfare on the European stage. The war began with the Prussian army's rapid advance into Silesia, catching the Habsburg forces off guard. Frederick's first major victory came at the Battle of Mollwitz in April 1741, where, despite early setbacks and the inexperience of his troops, the Prussian forces managed to rout the Austrians. This victory was not just a military success, it was a crucial moment of validation for Frederick, proving to both his allies and enemies that Prussia was a force to be reckoned with. Frederick's strategies during the First Silesian War were marked by a blend of bold offensives and shrewd diplomacy. He understood that his ambitions in Silesia were part of a larger European struggle, and he sought to secure his gains through alliances and negotiations. By the end of 1742, the conflict was brought to a close with the Treaty of Breslau, in which Austria ceded most of Silesia to Prussia. This treaty was a monumental achievement for Frederick. Prussia had not only expanded its territory, but had also asserted itself as a major player in European politics. However, the peace would not last long. The underlying tensions between Prussia and Austria Frederick's appetite for power was far from sated. In 1744, just 2 years after the conclusion of the First Silesian War, Frederick launched a renewed campaign against Austria, sparking the Second Silesian War, 1744 to 1745. This time, the stakes were even higher, as Austria had regrouped, and Maria Theresa was determined to reclaim her lost province. The Second Silesian War was a brutal and hard-fought conflict. Frederick's military acumen was put to the test as he faced a more prepared and determined Austrian army. One of the key battles of this war was the Battle of Hohenfriedberg in June 1745, where Frederick's forces achieved a decisive victory over the Austrians. The battle is often cited as one of Frederick's greatest triumphs, showcasing his ability to outmaneuver and outthink his opponents on the battlefield. His use of rapid, coordinated infantry attacks and his understanding of terrain played a critical role in securing victory. As the war dragged on, both sides began to tire, and the cost of the conflict weighed heavily on Austria. By late 1745, it became clear that neither side could sustain the fight much longer. The war finally ended with the Treaty of Dresden in December 1745, which confirmed Prussia's control over Silesia. The treaty also marked a significant shift in the balance of power in Europe. Prussia had emerged from the Silesian Wars not just as a territorial gainer, but as a major European power, capable of challenging even the mighty Habsburgs. The impact of the Silesian Wars on Prussia and Europe was profound. For Frederick, these wars were more than just military victories. They were this crucible in which his reputation as a military genius was forged. The success of his campaigns against Austria secured his place among the great rulers of Europe and laid the foundation for Prussia's rise as a leading state in the German-speaking world. Moreover, the acquisition of Silesia provided Prussia with valuable resources and a strategic position that would prove crucial in the years to come. As Frederick solidified his hold on Silesia and basked in the glory of his military achievements, he knew that his battles were far from over. The Silesian Wars had established Prussia's might, but they had also sown the seeds for future conflicts. Europe's great powers were now acutely aware of Prussia's ambitions, and tensions were simmering just below the surface. Frederick's next great challenge was on the horizon, a conflict that would dwarf even the Silesian Wars in scale and significance: the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War, often described as the first true global conflict, was a monumental struggle that pitted the great powers of Europe against each other in a contest that would shape the future of the continent, and indeed the world. At the heart of this war was Frederick the Great, a king whose ambitions and military genius would be tested to their very limits. The war's origins lay in the shifting alliances and deep-seated rivalries that had been simmering since the conclusion of the War of Austrian Succession. By the mid-1750s, Europe was a tinderbox, and Frederick, ever the strategist, knew that he could not afford to wait for the spark. The geopolitical landscape was tense, with old alliances breaking down and new ones forming in their place. Austria, still smarting from its losses in the Silesian Wars, sought to regain its lost territory and prestige. To this end, Austria forged an alliance with France and Russia, two powers traditionally each other, forming a formidable coalition against Prussia. Frederick, aware of the encirclement forming around his kingdom, knew that a preemptive strike was his best chance of survival. In August 1756, he launched an invasion of Saxony, a small but strategically important state allied with Austria. This bold move marked the beginning of the 7 Years' War, thrusting Europe into a conflict of unprecedented scale and intensity. The war began with a series of campaigns that would both cement Frederick's reputation as a military genius and expose the vulnerabilities of his position. The first significant engagement of the war was the Battle of Lobositz in October 1756. Here, Frederick's forces faced the Austrians in a hard-fought battle that ended in a Prussian victory. The success at Lobositz was significant for several reasons. It not only secured Prussia's foothold in Saxony, but also demonstrated Frederick's ability to outmaneuver and outthink his opponents, even when faced with superior numbers. This early victory bolstered the morale of the Prussian army and set the stage for the intense campaigns that would follow. But it was in 1757 that Frederick's military prowess truly shone. The Battle of Rossbach, fought on November 5th, 1757, stands out as one of his most celebrated victories. Facing a Franco-imperial army nearly twice the size of his own, Frederick employed a combination of deception, rapid movement, and precise coordination to achieve a stunning victory. In just over an hour, the Prussian forces routed the enemy, inflicting heavy casualties while suffering minimal losses themselves. The victory at Rossbach not only crushed the immediate threat to Prussia, but also sent shockwaves through Europe. It was a masterclass in the art of war, solidifying Frederick's reputation as one of the greatest commanders of his age. Barely a month after Rossbach, Frederick secured another decisive victory at the Battle of Leuthen on December 5th, 1757. This time, Frederick's opponent was the Austrian army, which had invaded Silesia in an attempt to reclaim the province. Leuthen was a battle of tactics and terrain, with Frederick using his intimate knowledge of the landscape to outflank and envelop the Austrian forces. The Prussian army's disciplined manoeuvring and relentless attacks broke the Austrian lines, leading to a complete rout. Leuthen was more than just a battlefield triumph. It was a strategic victory that secured Silesia for Prussia and kept the Austrian threat at bay, at least for the time being. However, the war was far from over, and Frederick soon found himself facing increasingly difficult challenges. The year 1758 marked the beginning of a grueling period for Prussia. One of the key campaigns during this time was the Siege of Olmütz, where Frederick attempted to capture the Austrian fortress in Moravia. The siege, however, turned into a protracted and costly affair. Despite his best efforts, Frederick was forced to abandon the siege after suffering heavy losses and logistical setbacks. The failure at Olmütz was a bitter pill for Frederick to swallow, signalling that his enemies were learning to counter his tactics and that the war would be a long, hard slog. The setbacks continued in 1759 with the disastrous Battle of Kunersdorf, one of the darkest moments in Frederick's military career. On August 12th, 1759, Frederick's army engaged a combined Russian and Austrian force near Frankfurt under Oder. The battle was a catastrophe for Prussia. Prussia. After hours of brutal fighting, Frederick's army was decimated, suffering staggering casualties. For the first time in the war, Frederick contemplated suicide, believing that all was lost. The defeat at Kunersdorf shattered the myth of Prussian invincibility and left Frederick's kingdom on the brink of collapse. But just as the situation seemed most dire, fortune took a remarkable turn. The year 1762 brought what has since been dubbed the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. The death of Empress Elizabeth of Russia in January 1762 led to the ascension of Peter III, a great admirer of Frederick. Peter immediately withdrew Russia from the war, signing a peace treaty with Prussia and effectively saving Frederick from the jaws of defeat. This unexpected reversal of fortune allowed Frederick to regroup and regain the initiative in the conflict. Although the war continued, the withdrawal of Russian forces eased the pressure on Prussia and shifted the balance back in Frederick's favour. By 1763, after years of brutal fighting, all sides were exhausted, and the war finally drew to a close with the Treaty of Bertelsburg. This treaty, signed in February 1763, effectively restored the status quo ante bellum, with Prussia retaining control of Silesia. While the treaty did not result in significant territorial changes, it had profound implications for the European balance of power. Prussia emerged from the war battered but unbowed, its status as a great power firmly established. For Frederick, the 7 Years' War was both a personal and political triumph, confirming his place as one of Europe's most formidable rulers. The legacy of the 7 Years' War extended far beyond the borders of Prussia. It reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe, laying the groundwork for future conflicts and alliances. Frederick's military tactics and leadership during the war became subjects of study for generations of military leaders, influencing the development of modern warfare. But the war also took a heavy toll on Frederick and his kingdom, draining resources and leaving much of Prussia in ruins. As the dust settled, Frederick turned his attention inward, focusing on the task of rebuilding his war-ravaged kingdom and implementing the domestic policies and reforms that would define the next phase of his reign. After the grueling years of the 7 Years' War, Frederick the Great turned his sharp mind from the battlefield to the more nuanced and complex task of governing his kingdom. The war had left Prussia both triumphant and scarred, with much of its land devastated and its people weary. Frederick recognised that to secure Prussia's future, he needed to strengthen the state from within. Thus began a period of intense domestic reform, where Frederick sought to centralise power, modernise the economy, and lay the foundations for a stronger, more resilient Prussia. Frederick's approach to governance was characterised by a meticulous attention to detail and a firm belief in the necessity of a strong, centralised state. He inherited a kingdom where the authority of the monarch was already considerable, but he worked to enhance this power by streamlining the administration and ensuring that the civil service operated with military precision. Frederick demanded efficiency and accountability from his bureaucrats, cutting through the layers of aristocratic privilege that had previously hampered effective governance. He established a merit-based system within the civil service, where where positions were awarded based on competence rather than birthright, thereby ensuring that the machinery of the state ran smoothly and effectively. At the heart of Frederick's domestic reforms was his vision for a modern Prussian economy. He recognised that economic strength was the backbone of a powerful state, and he set about transforming Prussia from a war-ravaged kingdom into a thriving economic power. One of his key focuses was agriculture, the lifeblood of Prussia's rural economy. Frederick implemented a series of agricultural reforms, encouraging the reclamation of wasteland and the introduction of new crops such as potatoes and turnips, which would become staples of the Prussian diet. He also promoted scientific farming methods and provided incentives for farmers to adopt more efficient practices. These efforts not only increased food production, but also helped stabilise the economy in the aftermath of the war. In addition to agricultural reforms, Frederick sought to promote trade and support industrialisation. He understood that for Prussia to compete with its European rivals, it needed a strong industrial base. Frederick encouraged the development of textiles, mining, and manufacturing, offering tax incentives and state support to entrepreneurs willing to invest in these sectors. He also worked to improve Prussia's infrastructure, building roads and canals to facilitate the movement of goods and people. These economic policies helped lay the groundwork for Prussia's later industrial expansion, transforming the kingdom into an economic powerhouse. Frederick's vision for Prussia extended beyond economic and administrative reforms. He also had a deep commitment to the intellectual and cultural development of his kingdom. A true child of the Enlightenment, Frederick was a patron of the arts and a supporter of education. He believed that a well-educated populace was essential for the prosperity of the state, and worked to expand access to education across Prussia. Under his reign, new schools were established, and existing ones were reformed to improve the quality of instruction. Frederick also founded the Berlin Academy of Sciences, which became a leading centre of intellectual life in Europe, attracting scholars from across the continent. Frederick's engagement with the Enlightenment was perhaps best exemplified by his relationship with the French philosopher Voltaire. The two men shared a mutual respect and corresponded frequently, discussing everything from philosophy to politics. Frederick admired Voltaire's wit and intellect, and Voltaire in turn praised Frederick as a philosopher king, a ruler who sought to govern with reason and justice. Although their friendship would later be tested by disagreements and misunderstandings, the influence of Enlightenment thought on Frederick's reign was undeniable. He sought to apply these principles in his governance, promoting tolerance, reason, and progress within his kingdom. One of the most significant areas where Frederick applied these Enlightenment ideals was in the realm of legal reform. He believed that a just and efficient legal system was crucial to the functioning of the state and the welfare of its citizens. To this end, Frederick undertook the ambitious project of codifying Prussian law, a process that culminated in the creation of the Prussian Civil Code. This code standardized laws across the kingdom, ensuring that justice was administered fairly and consistently. It also limited the power of local nobles and curtailed arbitrary rule, reinforcing the authority of the central government. Frederick's legal reforms reflected his commitment to rational governance and his desire to create a state that was both strong and just. As Frederick the Prussia's government, economy, and society. His domestic policies not only strengthened the state, but also laid the foundation for Prussia's future as a major European power. However, even as he focused on these internal improvements, Frederick could not escape the passage of time. As he grew older, the challenges of ruling a kingdom and the burdens of his legacy began to weigh more heavily upon him. As the years passed and the burdens of rule grew heavier, Frederick the Great found solace in the quiet retreat of Sanssouci Palace, his beloved refuge from the pressures of kingship. Nestled in the rolling hills of Potsdam, Sanssouci was more than just a residence. It was the embodiment of Frederick's personal tastes and philosophical leanings. Here, away from the rigours of governance and the clamour of war, Frederick indulged in his passions for the arts, music, and intellectual discourse. The palace became a sanctuary where he could live according to his own rhythms, surrounded by the beauty and culture he so cherished. It was here, amid the tranquillity of his gardens and the elegance of his Rococo-style rooms, that Frederick's true character as a philosopher-king came to the fore. Frederick's later years were marked by a certain melancholy, a reflection perhaps of the immense weight he had carried throughout his life. He remained a disciplined and austere figure, rising early each morning and maintaining a Spartan routine, even as his health began to decline. His love for music never waned. He often played the flute, a skill he had honed to near perfection, and hosted intimate concerts at Sanssouci. Yet, despite his retreat from the battlefield, Frederick never fully abandoned his role as a ruler. He continued to correspond with the leading intellectuals of the day, engaging in discussions that ranged from politics to philosophy, always seeking to balance the demands of his position with his personal quest for knowledge and enlightenment. Even in his later years, Frederick could not completely escape the spectre of war. Although the most intense conflicts of his reign were behind him, the king found himself once more drawn into military engagements. These final campaigns were less about territorial ambition and more about maintaining the delicate balance of power that had come to define Europe in the 18th century. Frederick's last significant military engagement came during the War of the Bavarian Succession in 1778 to 1779, a conflict that, while not as bloody or decisive as his earlier wars, demonstrated his enduring strategic acumen and his commitment to securing Prussia's interests on the European stage. The significance of Frederick's reign cannot be overstated. By the time of his death in 1786, Frederick had transformed Prussia from a relatively minor German state into one of the foremost powers of Europe. His military conquests had expanded Prussia's territory and influence, while his domestic reforms had strengthened the state's foundations, ensuring its prosperity for generations to come. Frederick's vision of a centralised, efficient, and enlightened state laid the groundwork for the later unification of Germany and the rise of the German Empire in the 19th century. His legacy as Frederick the Great was cemented not just by his victories on the battlefield, but by his ability to marry the ideals of the Enlightenment with the realities of governance. Yet, Frederick's legacy is not without its complexities. Historians have long debated the nature of his rule and the extent to which he truly embodied the ideals of the Enlightenment. On the one hand, Frederick is celebrated as a military his reign was marked by authoritarianism, and that his enlightened despotism often masked the harsher realities of his rule. Frederick's consolidation of power and his rigorous control over Prussian society left little room for dissent, and his military campaigns, while successful, came at a great human and economic cost. Despite these debates, Frederick remains a towering figure in the annals of history. His life and reign continue to inspire both admiration and scrutiny, with scholars exploring the nuances of his character and the lasting impact of his policies. Frederick's ability to navigate the turbulent political landscape of his time, his dedication to the welfare of his state, and his enduring contributions to European culture and thought ensure that he remains a subject of fascination and study. As the sun set on Frederick's remarkable life, the challenges of his later years and the weight of his legacy became ever more apparent. The king who had once reshaped the map of Europe now faced the inexorable passage of time, and the question of how history would remember him lingered in the air. Frederick the Great's journey from a reluctant prince to a formidable ruler is a story of determination, intellect, and ambition. His rise to power was marked by a relentless drive to prove himself, first through his daring military campaigns, and later through his sweeping domestic reforms. Frederick's victories in the Silesian Wars and his leadership during the 7 Years' War transformed Prussia from a relatively obscure kingdom into a European powerhouse. His military brilliance, particularly in battles like Rossbach and Leuthen, secured his reputation as one of history's great commanders, while his resilience in the face of adversity, such as during the disastrous Battle of Kunersdorf, showcased his unwavering resolve. Yet, Frederick was not just a man of war. He was also a ruler, deeply invested in the welfare of his state. His domestic policies reflected a commitment to modernizing Prussia, from centralizing the government and reforming the legal system, to fostering economic growth and promoting education. Frederick's vision for Prussia was one of efficiency, enlightenment, and progress, and his reforms laid the groundwork for the kingdom's future strength. His patronage of the arts and his support for intellectual discourse further cemented his legacy as a philosopher king, a ruler who sought not only to expand his territory, but also to elevate the cultural and intellectual life of his people. Frederick's influence extends far beyond his own time. The Prussia he shaped became the foundation for the later unification of Germany, and his ideas about governance, military strategy, and statecraft have left an indelible mark on European history. Even today, Frederick's legacy can be seen in the modern German state, in his emphasis on efficiency, education, and a strong, centralized government. His life and reign continue to be studied and debated, with historians and scholars exploring the many facets of his complex character. It is this complexity that makes Frederick such a fascinating figure. He was a man of contrasts, a warrior and a philosopher, an autocrat and a reformer. His achievements are undeniable, but so too are the controversies that surround his rule. Frederick's centralization of power and his military campaigns came at a significant cost, both to his people and to his enemies. Yet, it is precisely this balance of light and shadow that makes Frederick the Great a subject worthy of continued you to subscribe to the ASMR History channel. Here, I blend the rich stories of history with the calming experience of ASMR, making the past not only informative, but also soothing. By subscribing, you'll ensure that you never miss an episode as I continue to explore the lives of history's most intriguing figures, all delivered